The desert does not care for names or pasts. It asks only one question: will you endure? And it asks this with every sunrise and with every shadow. The wind in Serpent's Maw Canyon spoke only of death. It whispered through the charred ribs of the Hayes family wagon and stirred the ashes of a life extinguished. A gnarled oak tree stood as the sole witness, its branches casting long, skeletal shadows over the blighted earth. Beneath it, amidst the ruin, a hand moved. Not a final spasm, but a deliberate clench of will. Kalen, a Cheyenne warrior whose face was a mask of grim purpose, reined in his pinto. He had been tracking the scent of violence for 2 days, expecting only to find the cold trail of Corbin Shaw's men. He was not looking for survivors. He was hunting for justice, a debt to be paid in blood for the sister Shaw had stolen from his people. This scene was just another scar on the land. He dismounted, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed dirt. The air was thick with the metallic tang of shed blood and the bitter smell of burnt pine. He moved toward the shattered wagon wheel where he had seen the movement. A young woman lay there, half buried in dust and debris. Her fair hair was matted with dirt and a dark stain that he knew was not her own. Her calico dress was torn, her face pale as alabaster. He knelt, his expression unchanging, expecting to confirm another soul had departed. But as he reached out, her eyelids fluttered open. They were the color of a summer sky, clouded with shock and pain, but they held a flicker of life. In a place of absolute endings, he had found a beginning. Her lips parted, but only a dry, rasping sound escaped. Kalen uncorked his water skin, lifting her head with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his hardened exterior. He let a few drops of water moisten her lips. Her gaze never left his face, searching, questioning. There was fear there, but beneath it, something else. A stubborn refusal to surrender. He saw it in the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled weakly against the dirt. He had seen that same look in the eyes of a cornered wolf. It was the look of a fighter. He felt an unexpected shift within him, a stirring of something other than vengeance. This was not just a victim. She was a survivor, and her silence was louder than any scream. He carefully examined her, finding a deep gash on her shoulder, likely from a stray bullet. It was raw and needed tending. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as fragile as a bird. Yet he could feel the tension in her body, the will to live pulsing faintly. He carried her away from the wreckage, away from the ghosts that lingered under the solemn oak. As he walked toward the hidden rock formations that lined the canyon, he felt her gaze on him. It was a look that held the weight of all she had lost. He did not offer empty words of comfort. The wilderness had taught him that survival was not built on words but on action. And his first action was to keep this faint flame of life from being extinguished by the wind. Eleanora Hayes drifted back to consciousness slowly, like a swimmer rising from deep water. The first thing she registered was the scent of sage and juniper, not the acrid smell of smoke. She was not on the cold, unforgiving ground, but on a soft bed of pine boughs. A small fire crackled nearby, its warmth, a welcome comfort against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The pain in her shoulder was a dull, throbbing ache, a constant reminder of the chaos. She turned her head, her movements stiff, and saw him. Her rescuer sat across the small cave, the firelight dancing across the sharp angles of his face. He was cleaning his Winchester rifle, his hands moving with an economy and precision that was mesmerizing. She watched him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was an Apache warrior, the kind her father had warned her about in hushed tones. Yet there was no menace in his posture. He was utterly focused on his task, his presence filling the small space not with threat, but with a profound stillness. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the sandstone walls that enclosed them. The cave was his home, the wilderness his domain. She, in her torn dress and with her civilized fears, was the intruder here. He had not spoken a single word to her, yet he had saved her life. The contradiction was a puzzle her weary mind could not solve. She closed her eyes, the image of his focused calm, a strange anchor in her sea of grief. When she opened her eyes again, he was looking at her. His dark eyes were not cold or curious, but simply aware. They held a depth she could not fathom, like looking into a starless night sky. He set his rifle aside and rose, moving with a fluid grace. He brought her a small wooden bowl filled with a warm, savory broth. The smell alone made her stomach ache with a hunger she had not realized she felt. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her shoulder, and she fell back with a gasp. He was beside her in an instant, his arm supporting her back as he helped her into a sitting position. His touch was firm and steady, his proximity both unnerving and reassuring. She took the bowl, her hands trembling so much she nearly spilled its contents. He steadied her hands with his own. His skin was warm and rough against hers. The contact sent a jolt through her, a spark of life in the numbness of her grief. She ate slowly, the warm liquid a balm to her ravaged body and soul. He watched her, his silence a heavy blanket. When she was finished, he took the empty bowl and returned to his side of the fire. He had saved her, sheltered her, and fed her, all without a word. In the flickering firelight, Eleanor began to understand that this man, this stranger from a world so different from her own, was the only reason she was still alive. And she did not even know his name. The next morning, the pain in her shoulder had subsided to a manageable ache. She managed to sit up on her own, feeling a small surge of pride at the simple act. Her rescuer was already awake, tending to the fire. He glanced at her, a silent acknowledgement. She cleared her throat, the sound loud in the quiet cave. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy. He turned to face her fully. "You are welcome," he replied. His English was perfect, with only a slight, musical cadence that betrayed his origins. The sound of his voice, low and calm, surprised her. It was not the voice of the savage she had been taught to fear. It was the voice of a man. "My name is Eleanor Hayes." "I am Kalen," he said simply. He offered no more, and she did not press. He rose and walked to the mouth of the cave, his silhouette framed against the bright morning sky. "The men who did this, I hunt them." Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They follow a man named Corbin Shaw," Kalen replied, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "He takes what he wants: land, water, people. He believes this country belongs to him." The name meant nothing to her, but the description painted a vivid picture of the evil that had shattered her world. She now had a name for her nightmares. Kalen turned back to her, his eyes holding a new intensity. "He is a traitor in human misery. He drives settlers from their land, then buys it for nothing from the government. He sells guns to those who would use them for war. His greed is a sickness that poisons the earth." He spoke of Shaw not with anger, but with a cold, hard certainty, like a judge pronouncing a sentence. Eleanor pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "My family," she began, her voice breaking. "They only wanted to build a home." Kalen's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Shaw does not care for homes. He only cares for the gold that can be dug from under them, or the water that flows through them." He walked back to the fire and picked up a small pouch. From it he took a poultice of crushed herbs and gently began to redress her wound. His touch was surprisingly tender. "I have tracked him for many moons," Kalen continued, his voice low. "He has taken much from my people. He has taken much from your people. He does not see the difference. He sees only prey." As he worked, Eleanor looked at the man who was both a warrior and a healer. She had been found by the one man in this vast, empty land who was hunting the same monster she was. She was no longer just a victim, she was a witness. And in the quiet resolve of the man beside her, she felt the first stirrings of a desire for something more than just survival. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Kalen would leave at dawn, returning at dusk with a rabbit or a brace of quail. Eleanor's strength slowly returned. Her shoulder began to heal, leaving a puckered scar that she would carry forever. She spent her days exploring the small cave, watching the lizards sun themselves on the rocks, and thinking. She thought about her family, her past, and the uncertain future. Most of all, she thought about Kalen. He remained a mystery, a man of profound silences and sudden, startling insights. He moved through the world with a purpose and a grace that she had never seen before. He was a part of this wild land, and she was beginning to feel less like a stranger in it. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Why do you help me, Kalen?" He did not answer immediately. He stared into the fire, his face a study in concentration. The silence stretched, and she began to think he would not answer. Then, he spoke, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear him. "Because I know what it is to lose everything to one man's greed." He turned his gaze from the fire to her, and for the first time she saw the raw pain he kept so carefully hidden. It was a pain that mirrored her own. "Corbin Shaw's men came to our winter camp 2 years ago," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They were not soldiers, they were thieves. They came for furs and horses. They took what they wanted." He paused, and the crackle of the fire was the only sound. "They also took my sister, Ayasha. She was young, full of life. Shaw saw her, and he wanted her. He took her, just as he took your land." The story fell into the space between them, a heavy, terrible thing. Eleonora felt her own grief swell in her chest, mingling with his. She saw now that his hunt for Shaw was not just for justice. It was personal. It was a desperate, aching quest to reclaim a piece of his own soul. She reached out, her hand resting on his arm. It was a simple gesture, an impulse she did not fully understand. He did not pull away. He simply sat there, allowing the contact. "I am sorry," she whispered. The words were inadequate, but they were all she had. He looked at her, and the wall he kept around himself seemed to crack, just for a moment. "In your eyes," he said softly, "I see the same fire that was in hers, the fire to live." In that moment, they were not a Cheyenne warrior and a settler's daughter. They were two people bound by a shared loss, two survivors finding a fragile solace in the company of another. The fire between them burned a little brighter, a small beacon of warmth in a cold, unforgiving world. A week after the attack, Eleanor felt strong enough to ride. The need to return to the site of the massacre was a gnawing ache inside her. She needed to say goodbye. She needed to face the ghosts. When she told Kalen, he simply nodded, his eyes showing he understood. He saddled his pinto and helped her onto a quiet mare he had captured and tamed. They rode in silence, the landscape a blur of red rock and pale green sagebrush. When they arrived, the scene was just as she remembered it, a monument to destruction under the stoic gaze of the old oak tree. The air was still heavy with the silence of what had happened there. But this time, she was not alone. She dismounted, her legs unsteady. Kalen remained on his horse, giving her space. She walked through the debris, her fingers tracing the scorched wood of the wagon. She did not weep. Her tears had been burned away in the fire of her grief. Instead, a cold resolve settled over her. Her father had always told her that the land was their future. He had been so proud of the deed he had secured. She began to search, not knowing what she was looking for. Her hands sifted through the ashes, through the remnants of a life that was no longer hers. Then, her fingers brushed against something cold and hard. It was a small metal box, dented and blackened by the fire. The lock had been broken. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, miraculously unharmed, was a folded document. It was the land deed, and tucked within its folds was a hand-drawn map. It showed the location of a spring, a source of fresh water hidden in a small canyon on their property, the only reliable water source for miles. Suddenly, everything became clear. It was not random violence. It was a calculated act of theft. They had been murdered for water, the lifeblood of this arid land. She looked up at Kalen, the deed clutched in her hand. "This is why," she said, her voice shaking with a new kind of anger. "It was for the water." Kalen dismounted and walked to her side. He looked at the map, his expression grim. "Water is more valuable than gold out here," he said. "With this spring, Shaw can control the entire valley." Now they had proof. Now they had a motive. This small piece of paper was both a death warrant and a declaration of war. That afternoon, they buried her family. They worked together using their bare hands and a piece of splintered wood to dig shallow graves in the hard earth. They laid her parents and her younger brother to rest at the base of the oak tree, covering the graves with a mound of stones. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Eleonora made a silent vow. They would not be forgotten, and their land would not be stolen. 2 days later, the sound of approaching horses sent Kaelin to the mouth of the cave, rifle in hand. Eleonora's heart hammered against her ribs. 2 riders emerged from the canyon pass. One wore the tarnished star of a deputy sheriff. The other was a grizzled man with the hard, squinting eyes of a tracker. The deputy raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "We are looking for a Miss Eleonora Hayes," he called out, his voice echoing slightly against the rocks. "We heard about the attack on the Monroe wagon train. Came to see if there were any survivors." Eleonora froze. Monroe. He had used the wrong name. It was a small mistake, but in this land of shifting loyalties, small mistakes could be fatal. Kaelin remained silent, a statue carved from rock and shadow. Eleonora stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. "I am Eleonora Hayes," she said, her voice steady. The deputy, a man with a thin mustache and shifty eyes who introduced himself as Marcus, gave her a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Thank the Lord," he said with false piety. "We have come to escort you to safety in Dust Devil Gulch." His gaze flickered past her, into the darkness of the cave where her saddlebags lay. The saddlebags that held the metal box with the deed. The look was fleeting, but she saw it. A flicker of greed. A hunter's assessment of his prey. "How did you know my name?" Eleonora asked, her tone even. Deputy Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second. "We found some papers at the site. A family Bible." It was a clumsy lie. She knew the Bible had been consumed by the fire. She had watched it burn. These men were not here to save her. They were here to finish the job Corbinshaw's men had started. They were here for the deed. She felt a cold dread, but also a surge of defiance. She would not be a frightened lamb led to the slaughter. She had survived the fire. She would survive this. Her gaze met Kaelin's, and in the space of a heartbeat, an understanding passed between them. "I am grateful for your concern, Deputy," Eleonora said, her voice polite but firm. "But I am safe here." Marcus's smile tightened. "Now, miss, this is no place for a lady, and you are in the company of a savage." He spat the last word, his eyes flashing with contempt as he looked at Kaelin. "We must insist you come with us." The tracker's hand moved, inching toward the revolver at his hip. The air grew thick with tension. The peaceful canyon had become a stage for another confrontation. And Eleonora knew, with a chilling certainty, that this time she would not be a helpless victim hiding under a wagon. This time, she would fight back. "I will not go with you," Eleonora stated, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. She took a step back, positioning herself closer to the cave entrance and the rifle that leaned against the rock wall. Deputy Marcus's face hardened, the thin veneer of civility cracking. "That was not a request, miss. You will come with us." "Shaw wants that deed, and he wants the witness silenced." The tracker drew his firearm. "Now, let us not have any trouble," Marcus sneered. But trouble had already arrived. Before the tracker could aim, a shot echoed through the canyon. It was not a loud boom, but a sharp crack. The revolver flew from the tracker's hand as he cried out in pain, a dark hole appearing in his forearm. Kaelin had not seemed to move, yet his rifle was now at his shoulder, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. Marcus, startled, dove for the cover of his horse, drawing his own weapon. He fired blindly toward the cave, the bullets ricocheting off the rocks with angry whines. Eleonora did not hesitate. She scrambled for her father's rifle, her hands closing around the familiar smooth wood of the stock. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. She remembered her father's lessons. Breathe, aim, squeeze. She rested the barrel on a rock ledge, took aim at the deputy's horse, and fired. The shot was true. The horse screamed and bucked, throwing the deputy to the ground. Kaelin used the distraction to fire again, pinning Marcus behind the fallen animal. The wounded tracker, clutching his bleeding arm, tried to crawl away, but Kaelin's next shot kicked up dust right in front of his face, a clear warning. The man froze, his face a mask of terror. The canyon, which had erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, fell silent once more. The battle had been short, brutal, and decisive. They had won the first skirmish. But Eleonora knew this was far from over. Corbin Shaw was not a man who would accept defeat easily. Deputy Marcus, seeing his advantage lost, scrambled onto the tracker's horse. "This is not over," he yelled, his voice filled with impotent rage. "Shaw will hear of this. He will send men. He will burn you out of this canyon, you and your heathen lover." He spurred the horse, galloping away and leaving his wounded companion behind. Kalen watched him go, his expression unreadable. Eleonora's hands were shaking, the adrenaline of the fight leaving her weak. She looked at the wounded tracker, who was now whimpering in the dust. Then she looked at Kalen, who stood like a guardian at the mouth of the cave. They had faced Shaw's men together, and together they had stood their ground. The silence after the deputy's departure was profound. The wounded tracker lay on the ground, his groans the only sound breaking the stillness. Kalen approached him cautiously, disarmed him, and bound his wound with a strip of cloth. He gave the man some water and left him tied securely to a scrub oak. "He will be found," Kalen said, his voice grim, "and he will tell them where we are." Eleonora nodded, her gaze turning to Kalen. She noticed for the first time the dark stains spreading on his buckskin shirt, high on his left arm. "You are hurt," she said, her voice filled with concern. A stray bullet from the deputy's wild firing had grazed him. He dismissed it as a scratch, but she insisted. Inside the cave, she gently pushed him to sit by the fire. With a focused intensity that surprised them both, she tore a strip from her petticoat and cleaned the wound. It was a shallow furrow, but it had bled freely. As she worked, her fingers brushed against his skin. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the heat of battle. They were no longer just rescuer and survivor. They were partners, allies. They had fought for each other. They had bled for each other. "They will come back," she said softly, her eyes meeting his across the flickering flames. "Yes," he agreed. "Shaw will not let this go. The deed, and now his pride, are at stake. He will send all his men." A heavy silence fell between them. The thought of facing a dozen guns was a daunting one. The cave was a good defensive position, but they could not hold out forever. Running was an option, but where would they go? Shaw's influence spread far, and to run would be to surrender the land her family had died for, to surrender the memory of his sister. They both knew, without saying it, that they would not run. "We will fight," Eleonora said, her voice low but steady. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Kalen looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his dark eyes. He saw not a frightened girl, but a woman of iron will. A woman who had faced death and chosen to live. A woman who was willing to stand and fight for what was right. He reached out and gently touched the scar on her shoulder. "We will fight together," he said. In that moment, something shifted between them. The shared danger and the quiet intimacy of the firelight stripped away the barriers of their different worlds. It was no longer just about survival or revenge. It was about a shared future, a future they would have to fight for. They spent the next 3 days preparing for a war. Kalen showed Eleonora the best vantage points, the hidden crevices in the rock that would provide cover. They stockpiled water and what little food they had. He taught her how to reload her father's rifle quickly, how to listen to the whispers of the wind for signs of approaching riders. In these tense hours, their reliance on each other grew. They moved with an unspoken understanding, their actions synchronized. A quiet word, a shared glance, was all that was needed. The fear was a constant presence, a cold knot in Eleonora's stomach. But the trust she had in the man beside her was a warmth that held the fear at bay. On the morning of the 4th day, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced their arrival. It was a small army. Corbin Shaw rode at their head, his face a thunderous mask of rage. Deputy Marcus was beside him, along with at least 10 other hard-faced men. They fanned out at the canyon entrance, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. "You have made a grave mistake," Shaw's voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. "Give me the girl and the deed, and I will let the savage live to see another sunrise. Refuse, and I will turn this canyon into your tomb." Kalen's only reply was a single, well-aimed shot that sent Shaw's hat flying from his head. The siege began. Shaw's men charged, but the narrow canyon entrance created a bottleneck. Kalen and Eleonora fired from their protected positions, their shots precise and deadly. They drove back the first wave, and the second. The canyon became a deadly shooting gallery. But Shaw was relentless. He sent men to scale the cliffs, trying to flank them. The hours crawled by, the sun beating down on the rocks. Their ammunition began to run low. Despair began to creep into Eleanor's heart. They had fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. It was only a matter of time. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon, a new sound reached them. The sound of more gunfire, but this time, it came from behind Shaw's men. Eleanora peered from her hiding place and saw a small group of riders charging down from the east. At their head was an older man with a shock of white hair. It was Dr. Alistair Croft, the doctor from Dust Devil Gulch. The tracker Kalen had left tied up had been found by a local rancher, and his story had spread. Dr. Croft, a man who despised Shaw's tyranny, had gathered a handful of ranchers who were tired of living in fear. They were not many, but they had come to help. The unexpected attack from the rear threw Shaw's men into chaos. They were caught in a crossfire. Dr. Croft and the ranchers, though outnumbered, were determined fighters. Corbin Shaw, seeing his plan unraveling, let out a roar of fury. Blinded by rage, he spurred his horse directly toward the cave, firing his revolver wildly. He was no longer a commander, he was a cornered animal. Kalen stepped out from behind the rocks to meet him, his rifle held steady. It was a duel that had been destined to happen. The land baron against the warrior. The man who took against the man who protected. Shaw fired twice. The first shot went wide. The second grazed the rock near Kalen's head, sending stone chips flying. Kalen did not flinch. He stood his ground, took a breath, and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Shaw square in the chest. The big man swayed in the saddle for a moment, a look of disbelief on his face, before toppling to the ground. A sudden, profound silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Seeing their leader fall, the rest of Shaw's gang lost their nerve. Some surrendered, while others fled into the wilderness. The battle for Serpent's Maw Canyon was over. The next day, a fragile peace settled over the valley. Dr. Croft tended to the wounded on both sides. His quiet competence, a soothing presence. He looked at the land deed in Eleanor's hand, and then at Kalen, who stood beside her. "This land has seen enough blood," the doctor said, his voice weary but kind. "Perhaps now it can see some peace." Eleanor looked out at the vast expanse of her family's claim. The pain of her loss was still a raw wound in her heart, but it was no longer all she felt. She felt the strength of the earth beneath her feet and the warmth of the man standing beside her. She had found something here amidst the ashes. She turned to Kalen, her hand finding his. "This is our home now," she said softly. He looked down at their joined hands, then into her eyes. His gaze held a future she had never dared to imagine. They would build a new life here, a life of peace and quiet dignity. They would honor the memory of those they had lost by creating a place where justice and kindness could take root. Over time, other families, drawn by the promise of water and safety, would settle nearby. The small community that grew around the spring became a testament to their courage. And above their small, sturdy cabin, the old oak tree stood watch, its leaves whispering the story of the warrior and the survivor who had found love in a place of death.